looking to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles and welcome to an hour-long program of ASEAN in Focus. On today's headlines. Two-day talks between India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations foreign ministers opened in New Delhi with calls for stronger ties between India and the regional bloc. China's Defense Minister General Wang Fei has accused the United States of trying to hijack the Indo-Pacific region by turning nations against Beijing. A top U.S. government official said there was no chance that Myanmar junta's planned elections next year would be free and fair. And President-elect Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. named former Senate President Juan Ponce Enrile, outgoing Justice Secretary Bernardo Guevara, and retired Army Forces of the Philippines Chief Jose Faustino Jr. as his new appointees in his cabinet. First in our news, two-day talks between India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN foreign ministers, opened in New Delhi with calls for stronger ties between India and the regional bloc. The talks come amid a heightened rivalry between China and the U.S., which Singapore said threatens peace in the region. Here's Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan talking about its direct implications for all of Asia. Take a look.
The world has also changed rapidly in the last few months, and by that I'm of course referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which in our view has upended the international system of rules and norms and international law, which we all depend on and operate on the basis of. The sharpening superpower rivalry between the United States and China has direct implications on all of us in Asia. So these developments, if unchecked, can threaten the whole system of peace and stability, which we have depended on for the basis of our growth, our development and prosperity over many decades.
In discussing the challenges, Indian Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar said the developments in Ukraine and their effects on food and security and energy, fertilizer and commodities prices and logistics, and supply chain disruptions had made the task of recovery from the pandemic more difficult. He said the role of ASEAN would be critical given the new geopolitical challenges and emphasized the need to improve land and sea connectivity between India and ASEAN countries. Take a look.
This path has become even more arduous with geopolitical headwinds, which we face due to developments in Ukraine and its knock-on effects on food and energy security, as well as fertilizer and commodity prices and logistics and supply chain disruptions. ASEAN has always stood tall as a beacon of regionalism, multilateralism, and globalization. It has successfully carved out a niche for itself in the region and provided the foundation for the evolving strategic and economic architecture in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN's role today is perhaps more important than ever before, given the geopolitical challenges and uncertainties that the world faces. India fully supports a strong, unified, and prosperous ASEAN, one whose centrality in the Indo-Pacific is fully recognized. The strong convergence of the AOIP and the IPOI is a testimony to our shared vision for the region. ASEAN-India ties, anchored in history and nurtured by a common ethos, has withstood the test of time and indeed grown stronger with each passing decade. Our sectoral partnership of 1992 matured into a summit-level partnership in 2002 and further evolved into a strategic partnership in 2012. As we enter the fourth decade of our relationship, our ties too must respond to the world that we confront. A better connected India and ASEAN would be well positioned to promote decentralized globalization and resilient and reliable supply chains that is so needed by the international community.
Meanwhile, highlighting the challenges the Indo-Pacific faces, Dr. Mohan Kumar, the chairman of the RIS policy think tank, said a multipolar Indo-Pacific is now a necessity. Plus, the war in Ukraine is also a defining moment for all, and Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said at the India-ASEAN Summit he called on nations to stand up and uphold rules-based international law, not just for the Western world, but one that recognizes the diversity from Asia. Let's listen in.
It is in the joint interest of India and ASEAN that there is no hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. In other words, a multipolar Indo-Pacific is not a luxury, but a necessity. Therefore, a comprehensive strategic partnership between India and ASEAN, which is what the co-chair's statement hints at, that a comprehensive strategic partnership would contribute significantly to a free, inclusive, prosperous, and dare I say, a multipolar Indo-Pacific.
Is that if we are able to maintain a rules-based international order, and rules not just written and codified and fossilized by the Western world, but one which recognizes the diversity and the wisdom of the ages from Asia and makes the necessary adjustments to the post-World War II international institutions like the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the Generalized Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is now the WTO. If we can make these institutions updated and fit for purpose and to adapt to the potential and the diversity of Asia, this will be a big plus for us. Another point on the rules-based international order has been highlighted by the invasion of Ukraine. If we continue to go back to a pre-World War means of engaging other countries, and if we continue to believe in might is right and that big countries get to redraw boundaries, citing historical errors and crazy decisions, then all bets are off. That is why Singapore, and in fact ASEAN, has taken a strong position against this invasion. So the point is that, and actually President Zelensky is right, and over the weekend when he addressed the Shangri-La Dialogue, he said, the battle for the rules are being fought on the battlefields of Ukraine. My point here is not to get into the details of Ukraine versus Russia, but to make the point that we do need a universally accepted, rules-based world order in which all of us have a say, all of us, big or small, wealthy or not so wealthy, are equal, and that those superpowers will feel and will assess that it is in their own enlightened self-interest to restrain themselves and to act according to international law.
Meanwhile, the defense chiefs of Japan and Australia vowed to continue their close bilateral coordination in what Tokyo called regional engagement. A joint statement released by the Japanese Defense Ministry said Japan's Defense Minister Kishi Nobuo met his Australian counterpart Richard Marles in Tokyo to discuss their bilateral relations, and the ministers meet as a food crunch is feared caused by the war in Ukraine and a continuing rivalry between Beijing and Western powers, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Take a look.
今や日豪はインド太平洋地域における平和と安定に大きな責任を有しています。両国の防衛力との強化と防衛協力の進展はその実現に必要不可欠なものとなっています。
We are of common mind on the strategic challenges we face, and we resolve to continue to cooperate on regional security. It is clear that our region faces the most complex set of strategic circumstances we have known since the end of the Second World War. What nations of the region do now matters. Indeed, the global shocks caused by the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and current inflationary pressures reinforce that this is not a time for going it alone. It's a time for increasing cooperation between close friends and partners.
Washington and its close allies, including Japan, Australia, and India, formed the Quad, an alliance created in the face of China's push for dominance across the region. Washington has also formed a wider Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or the IPEF, which has been signed by at least 13 nations, including the United States. The statement between the two added that Japan and Australia will also increase cooperation in the area of space and cyber. And Australia and China's defense ministers met for the first time in 3 years last Sunday, with the talks described as an important first step toward or following a period of strained ties. Richard Marles, whose center-left government came to power in May, held talks for over an hour with China's Wei Fenghe on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Summit in Singapore. Marles said the recent interception of an Australian patrol plane in international waters was a concern and was discussed. Take a look.
Brilliant. What did they bring to us?
On Friday night at the dinner, General Wei and I both met. We were sitting on the same table. We both agreed that it was important that our two countries meet. That's how the meeting came about today. It was hosted by China. The meeting went for more than an hour. As I say, it was a really important meeting, an important first step. This was an important meeting, one which the Australian government welcomes. It was an opportunity to have a very frank and full exchange in which I raised a number of issues of concern to Australia, including the incident involving Australia's P-8 aircraft on the 26th of May, and Australia's abiding interest in the Pacific and our concern to ensure that the countries of the Pacific are not put in a position of increased militarisation. We want to take this in a very sober and very deliberate manner. We don't underestimate the difficulties that we've had in our bilateral relationship. The fact that this is the first meeting at a ministerial level in almost 3 years is very significant. While there is a change of tone, there is absolutely no change in the substance of Australia's national interests.
Now, the Chinese government didn't offer any immediate comment following that meeting. Relations between Beijing and Canberra have grown frosty in recent years after the latter called for an independent probe into the origins of the pandemic and banned telecom giant Huawei from building Australia's 5G network. China, Australia's biggest trading partner, responded by imposing tariffs and disrupting more than a dozen key industries, including wine, barley, and coal. And during the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the U.S. will do its part to manage tensions with China and prevent conflict, even though Beijing is becoming increasingly aggressive in the Asian region. Take a look.
We'll also stand by our friends as they uphold their rights. And that's especially important as the PRC adopts a more coercive and aggressive approach to its territorial claims. In the East China Sea, the PRC's expanding fishing fleet is sparking tensions with its neighbors. In the South China Sea, the PRC is using outposts on man-made islands bristling with advanced weaponry to advance its illegal maritime claims. We're seeing PRC vessels plunder the region's provisions, operating illegally within the territorial waters of other Indo-Pacific countries. And further to the west, we see Beijing continue to harden its position along the border that it shares with India. You know, Indo-Pacific countries shouldn't face political intimidation, economic coercion, or harassment by maritime militias. So the Department of Defense will maintain our active presence across the Indo-Pacific. We will continue to support the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal ruling, and we will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows.
Meanwhile, China's Defense Minister General Wang Fenghe has accused the United States of trying to hijack the Indo-Pacific region by turning nations against Beijing. He declared that Washington is putting its own interests in the Pacific forward under the guise of multilateralism. Let's listen in.
We noticed Secretary Austin's remarks on the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. To us, the strategy is an attempt to build an exclusive small group in the name of a free and open Indo-Pacific to hijack countries in our region and target one specific country. It is a strategy to create conflict and confrontation to contain and encircle others. China holds that for any strategy to be viable, it should adapt to the historic and global trends and contribute to regional peace, stability, and the shared interests of all. We should not interfere in others' internal affairs and say no to unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. China calls for turning the South China Sea into a sea of peace, friendship, and cooperation. This is a shared wish and responsibility of countries in the region. Here, I think we need to answer three questions. First, who should we rely on to protect peace in the South China Sea? Thanks to the joint efforts of China and ASEAN countries, we have seen greater stability in the area. China respects freedom of navigation enjoyed by all countries under international law. Actually, freedom of navigation is not under threat in the South China Sea. China is one of the biggest beneficiaries of freedom of navigation in this area. If it were hampered in the South China Sea, China would suffer the most because without freedom of navigation, China's economy would hardly grow. However, some big power has long practiced navigation hegemony on the pretext of freedom of navigation. It has flexed muscles by sending warships and warplanes on a rampage in the South China Sea. As neighbors that cannot be moved away from each other, we countries in this region must stay vigilant and prevent some countries outside this region from meddling in the affairs of our region and turning the South China Sea into troubled waters.
Now, Mr. Wei urged Washington to stop smearing and containing China, to stop interfering in China's internal affairs, and stop harming China's interests. He also struck a more conciliatory tone at points, calling for a, quote, stable China-U.S. relationship, which he said was vital for global peace. And staying at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged international pressure to end a Russian naval blockade of Black Sea ports that has choked off his country's grain exports, threatening a global food crisis. Let's listen in.
Russia must feel that its belligerent policies will have consequences for itself as well. And if there are no such consequences, and if due to Russian blockade we are unable to export our foodstuffs, which is so sorely missing in global markets, the world will face an acute and severe food crisis and famine in many countries of Asia and Africa. The shortage of foodstuffs will inexorably lead to political chaos, which can result in the falling of many governments and the ousting of many politicians. And this is already plain to see. This looming threat is plain to see by just looking at the skyrocketing prices for basic products on the world markets and in certain countries. This is the direct consequence of the acts of the Russian state. And therefore, finally, we must restore the full might of the international law. Since 24th of February this year, the Russian missile strikes have killed 287 children. And this is just what we can tell you officially. We do not know so far how many people are buried in mass graves in the occupied territories and how many corpses are there in the rubbles of houses that the Russian army is controlling so far.
And take a look at some of these images, views of the damaged Nikatera grain terminal in Mykolaiv in southern Ukraine after Russian attacks on June 4. Before the Russian invasion, Ukraine was the world's top producer of sunflower oil and a major wheat exporter. But millions of tons of grain exports remain trapped due to the blockade. The United Nations and some countries are pushing for a maritime corridor to be opened up to allow exports to resume. Meanwhile, Mr. John Rain, the IISS Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence, assessed the key messages of President Volodymyr Zelensky's virtual address to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and why the war in Ukraine is important to the Indo-Pacific region. Again, let's listen in.
Shangri-La Dialogue has been exceptional. We had one obvious standout event, which was the address by President Zelensky to the dialogue, which he delivered by VTC from an undisclosed secure location in Ukraine. And the reason was not just because he is the person who carries probably the burden of the free world at the moment, but also because he spoke in clear terms about why what is happening in Ukraine matters to this region. So he was able to root the discussions and considerations of this region in the really uncomfortable reality of a war in Europe where a small, free, sovereign country has been invaded by an aggressor, very much larger than itself and acting in defiance of the international order. So that was a very special occasion for the dialogue and a really clear reminder of the interconnectedness of what is happening in the Eurasian, in the European theatre, and what is happening here in the Indo-Pacific.
Meanwhile, in the same summit in Singapore, the Netherlands Minister of Defense, Kasia Ollongren, also spoke and shared her views on the global security challenges the world faces due to the war in Ukraine and the U.S.-China rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. Again, let's listen in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in interesting times, and that is meant as ironically as it sounded. Europe and Asia have a shared stake in each other's security. Putin's territorial war shows how our continents are connected. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a global challenge with global ramifications. There is no far away. A war in one part of the world affects people across the globe. The war in Ukraine has already affected all of us, also people far beyond the European continent. From scarce energy supplies and rising prices, to bare shelves in our supermarkets. And if we fail to secure the export of Ukraine's grain and its harvest that's coming on, the entire world will have to face grave consequences as a food crisis looms. The whole world risks stagflation, global security, and the global economy are at risk. Development in the Indo-Pacific region also have growing impact on our global prosperity and collective security. As the oceans are the arteries of the global economy, the Indo-Pacific region is crucial in this regard. The seas need to be freely accessible to all, and that requires action by all of us collectively to uphold rule-based international order. We have begun to look beyond our own region, and we're ready to face the reality that regional threat landscapes are increasingly connected across borders, across continents. A paradigm shift has taken place towards recognizing global threats using a 360 degrees approach. Threats countries in Asia have been facing more consciously. Your experience can thus provide us with valuable lessons, also in Europe, because we are indeed drawing lessons. Putin has brought us together as never before. European countries have stepped up their game to provide security against present and future threats. And his actions have woken up the EU to its geopolitical role and the importance of defense cooperation.
And the news continues here on ASEAN in Focus. We'll be right back. Please stay tuned.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga...
could result in her being jailed for more than 150 years. Meanwhile, the United States has expressed concern over Cambodia's recent mass conviction of opposition figures, including an outspoken Cambodian-American activist, warning it represents part of an alarming pattern of actions that undermine democracy. Take a look.
Freedom. I am ready to pay the price of prison in order that I live out my conscience and my belief in freedom, in justice. It's because this regime will not let me go free. It will be an unfair and unjust verdict.
Now, State Department spokesman Ned Price said the U.S. calls on authorities of the Southeast Asian nations to release all those unjustly detained, including Thierry Sang, and protect freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. He said these actions undermine multi-party democracy and the rule of law. A Phnom Penh court convicted around 60 opposition figures on Tuesday in a mass trial that comes as the country's long-serving leader, Hun Sen, cracks down on dissent ahead of national elections next year. The defendants face charges ranging from treason to incitement and conspiracy over opposition leader Sam Rainsy's failure bid to return to Cambodia in 2019, a move characterized by the government as an aborted bid to overthrow Hun Sen. While some of those sentenced were senior figures in the now dissolved Cambodia National Rescue Party directly involved in organizing the return, many were prosecuted simply for posting support on social media. She has 500,000 followers on Instagram, leads a glamorous lifestyle, and describes herself as the little girl of former Premier Thaksin Shinawatra, one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern Thai history. The 35-year-old Paitongtarn Shinawatra, youngest of billionaire tycoon Thaksin's 3 children, is now launching herself into the country's deeply divided political scene ahead of a national election due by March 2023. Take a look.
I'm always proud of what's my dad doing, you know, what my dad did in the past. Today, I met a lot of people who said that they got a lot of benefits from when my dad was the prime minister and when my aunt was the prime minister. So, you know, who wouldn't be proud? You know, you're like when your dad and your aunt did so much for the country, and then who would I be, right? Yeah, he did so much good for the country. I am only proud of him. I'm only proud of my aunt. And if I have a chance, if even like a small chance, I would do good things for the country. That's my goal. Maybe because right now I'm turning 36, right? I don't think it's a problem at all. Look at all the women politicians right here. They are pretty and strong, and they're very determined. So I think it's nothing. Women can be leaders, of course. Oh, if you're here before, like 8 years ago, the country was so much better. Seriously, like so much better. You know, when my aunt was the prime minister, and then this happened. For 8 years right now, I think, as I told you earlier, if I only have like a small part to just make this country a better place, I'm gonna do it. You know, I'm gonna do it. I don't have to be any like important position. I'm just being like a Pheu Thai members. If I can do good stuff for the country.
For now, Paitongtarn has a low-key role with the main opposition Pheu Thai party, but she's widely tipped to be named its candidate for prime minister when an election is called. Paitongtarn says she draws strength from her father's unwavering support and insists she will always be his little girl. Thaksin, the former Manchester City owner who built a telecoms empire with a fortune estimated by Forbes at nearly $1.9 billion, now lives in self-imposed exile in Dubai to avoid corruption charges he says are politically motivated. His sister, Yingluck, was elected prime minister in 2011, but was herself deposed by General Prayut Chan-o-cha in a 2014 coup. Meanwhile, President-elect Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. named former Senate President Juan Ponce Enrile Outgoing Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara and retired Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief Jose Faustino Jr. as his new appointees in his cabinet. Enrile will re-enter public service as Marcos's presidential legal counsel. Press Secretary-designate Trixie Cruz Angeles said in a press statement. Enrile, a staunch supporter of Marcos and Vice President-elect Sara Duterte Carpio during the 2022 elections, he said he will devote his time and knowledge for the Republic and for BBM because he wants him to succeed, Enrile said, as quoted by Angeles. Meanwhile, Marcos has picked outgoing Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara as his Solicitor General and former AFP Chief of Staff, retired General Jose Faustino Jr., as Senior Undersecretary and Officer in charge of the Department of National Defense. And Cambodia and China Wednesday broke ground on a Beijing-funded project to revamp a naval base that the U.S. fears is intended for Chinese military use. Take a look. The Washington Post this week cited unnamed Western officials as saying the new facilities at Cambodia's Ream base, strategically located on the Gulf of Thailand, were being built for the exclusive use of the Chinese Navy. Both countries denied that allegation, with Phnom Penh saying the base's development is not a secret. The base has been a sore spot in U.S.-Cambodia relations for years, with Washington suspecting it's being converted for use by China as Beijing seeks to buttress its international influence with a network of military outposts. Concerns about the base go back as far as 2019, when the Wall Street Journal reported on a secret draft deal allowing Beijing to dock warships there. Indonesian authorities rescued 10 people, but a 7-year-old child remains missing after an air ambulance crashed in an Indonesian jungle near mountainous city Timika, Papua on Wednesday. Take a look.
Dia mengevakuasi ke-10 korban yang dinyatakan sempat terjadi crash, dan saat ini semua korbannya sudah berhasil dibawa ke rumah sakit daerah Timika.
The government-owned helicopter was carrying sick patients from remote villages in the easternmost region in the archipelago. The rescue of the missing minor is being continued. In other news in the region, Japanese fugitive Mitsuhiro Taniguchi, accused of swindling more than $7 million worth of government coronavirus subsidies meant for small businesses back home, is paraded by the Indonesian police before the media ahead of a press conference in Jakarta. Take a look.
We understand. The Embassy of Japan understands. The judge in Japan has issued an arrest warrant of him. The case is deceiving the Japanese government for subsidiary regarding COVID-19.
Hiro Taniguchi, 47 years old, was arrested in Lampung province in the south of Sumatra Island late Tuesday and was flown to the capital Jakarta, according to National Police spokesman Dery Prasetyo. The Japanese national and several associates are accused of submitting false applications to claim 960 million yen, or $7.2 million in COVID-19 relief funds meant for small businesses, according to Japanese media reports. Tokyo's Metropolitan Police Department had placed Taniguchi on an international wanted list after arresting his ex-wife and 2 sons on May 30 on suspicion of fraud, according to Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Taniguchi will be deported in coordination with the embassy. ASEAN in Focus will be back with more right after this break. Take a look.
Abangan sa Lutong Dasa.
Budol fight!
May chicken inasal, inihaw na liempo, nilasing na hipon at ensaladang Pinoy. Saan ka pa? At makakasama natin ang sweet na mag-asawa na sina Billy Joe Crawford at Colleen Garcia. Kainan na! Kita-kits sa Lutong Daza.
Kumanda ka!
Isang sugat mula noon. Nababakas hanggang ngayon. Handog ng Net25. Ang Korean novela na magbibigay pag-asa na maghihilo anumang sugat. At ang araw ay muling sisikat. A Place in the Sun. Simula June 27, alas 8 ng gabi. Dito lang sa Net25.
Panalo tayo pag together, walang talo pag together. Let's stand together sa Net25.
Welcome sa programa kung saan hindi ako kung hindi kayo ang bida. Ipapakita natin how our guest creatively blends two familiar dishes into one unique fusion treat. Okay. Napakasarap po ng kanyang lumpianisa in fairness. Para sa kanya, ang pag-akyat sa mga bundok ay hindi lamang adventure, kundi isang life-changing venture para sa kabataan. Bukod sa kanyang conified parody ng isang tindero, nagbebenta ng venti soybean curd with topping boba sinkers.
One soybean curd, 50% arnibal.
Marami pa siyang ibang feel-good content, all designed para mailabas nyo ang napakasarap na halakak. At wala nang mas sasarap pa sa pagkakataong madugtungan ang buhay ng iba kahit sa isang di sinasadyang pangyayari. Ako po ang inyong always feeling good host, Aga Mulak, welcoming you to another Saturday night experience dito sa Bida Kayo Kay Aga.
Welcome back. The news continues here on ASEAN in Focus. And now, the Filipino community in Barcelona, Spain, celebrated its 124th Independence Day. Lovely Apple Joyce Fabros was at the embassy. Let's take a look.
In commemoration of the 124th anniversary of the Philippine Independence Day, the Philippine Consulate General in Barcelona held a flag-raising ceremony. Headed by Consul General Maria Teresa S.M. Lazaro, the in-person occasion kicked off with a flag-raising ceremony whilst the Philippine national anthem was being sung. The occasion was under the theme Kalayaan 2022, Pagsuong sa Hamon ng Panibagong Bukas, or Freedom 2022, Facing the Challenge of a New Tomorrow. After the flag-raising ceremony, special remarks from the President of the Philippines and the Secretary of Foreign Affairs were shown. Representatives of various religions and some of the Filipino community in Barcelona were invited to give a short message regarding the celebration.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat na mahal na kababayan. Umaga ito pagtitipon po sa bahagi ng ibang bansa, ng Barcelona, sa Espanya, na aking kasama ang kababayang Pilipino upang ipagdiwang ang kasarinlan ay isang napalaking kasayahan, pag-aalakan sa aking puso ay aking nararamdaman ng aking Pilipino. At ngayon ay naramdaman ko na dapat natin itagin sa mga Pilipino upang ang lahat po ay maramdaman ang ating pagkakaisa sa pagiging kabayan at para sa magandang kinabukasan ng bansa ng Pilipinas.
Napaka-importante po ng pagkaroon ng mga kabayan natin ng Pilipinas sa mga lalo pa sa araw na ito ay pinapagkaroon natin ang araw ng kalayaan ng sa Pilipinas. At ang nakatutuwa ang mga kababayan natin mga Pilipino ay nagaling pa sa mga ibang lugar ay pumayag silang magkambay. May kakayagan gusto ko lang magpasaki, makita ng kanilang pagmamahal sa mga kababayan natin lalo sa
Attendees wore traditional Filipino attire to show their patriotic pride. After the ceremony, breakfasts were shared among the attendees. Consul General Lazaro once again reminded the Filipinos about the aim of the Philippine Consulate General in Barcelona, which is to make it a home away from home for the Filipinos.
So itong pagkakataon na to, sabi namin na parang mas maganda kung magkaroon tayo ng celebration ng Independence Day with the Filipino community. First time namin ito, and I think it's very successful. Kasi syempre kami sa konsulado, we can only do so much, no? That's why we are reaching out to the various Filipino organizations, sa mga leaders na magkaisa tayo, magkaroon tayo ng cooperation para mas makatulong tayo sa mga Filipino community. And isa pa, gusto ko rin na maging inclusive, na hindi lang puro leaders. Gusto ko maka-reach out dun sa mga Filipinos na hindi miyembro ng mga organisasyon. We want this to have a welcoming atmosphere for the Filipino community.
This is Lovely Apple Choice Fabros, Barcelona Bureau, Eagle News.
Thank you, Apple. Meanwhile, from Barcelona, Spain, we go to Thailand for the Philippine Independence Day celebrations. Here's Veronica Carino.
The Philippine Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand held an event for the commemoration of the 124th anniversary of the proclamation of the Philippine Independence with the theme, Rise Towards the Challenge of a New Beginning.
Ambassador Millicent Cruz Paredes, together with DFA officials, led the flag-raising ceremony, followed by panunumpa ng katapatan sa watawat ng Pilipinas. First, Consul General Michael Linden Garcia then read the letter from the outgoing DFA Secretary Teodoro Locsin Jr. In his letter, he mentioned how DFA supported various challenges that the pandemic has brought and commended OFWs as a source of pride and inspiration. He thanked President Rodrigo Duterte and DFA officials abroad and ended his letter with well wishes and appreciation to his colleagues. A letter from President Rodrigo Duterte was read by Ambassador Paredes, where he encouraged Filipinos to use their abilities, skills, and knowledge for the benefit of the nation. After reading President Rodrigo Duterte's message, Ambassador Paredes mentioned that on June 14th, it'll be the 73rd anniversary of Philippines and Thailand diplomatic relations and encouraged everyone to donate blood as it is also the World Blood Donors Day.
Because as you know, June 14th is also the World Blood Donors Day. And last year we started a tradition here at the embassy to donate blood to the Thai Red Cross. Goodwill for Thailand, being very generous to the Filipino community, and also in order to say thank you for taking care of our Filipino community here in Thailand. So we hope that we will be able to inspire the rest of the Filipino community. Thank you very much, at mabuhay ang Pilipinas, mabuhay ang ating kasarilan.
From Bangkok, Thailand, I am Veronica Carino reporting.
Thank you, Veronica. And that's it for today's broadcast. That is the latest news in the ASEAN region and beyond. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you back next week for ASEAN in Focus. Same time, same place. Stay in the news, stay alert. I'm Alma Angeles. Have a great week.